Chris, you're a organizational risk professional, so a slightly different perspective on the budget and forecasting process. Very interesting to hear your take on it. I know you've had to assess the effectiveness of these models and probably had some input to the process. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that's been.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to see how various organizations approach the budgeting and forecasting process. And what caught my attention from Shin Lee's comments, that's also relatable to what I've seen, is that people are spending a lot more time on a process, budgeting and redoing their forecasts over and over, rather than focusing on the business. And the danger we've seen is that people are using the budget as the tool to manage the business. That's actually not the right way to approach it. The budgeting process is a tool to assist. There are other tools we would use, cash flow, risk management, and other considerations to ensure that the business is managed properly. So one key takeaway I've seen is that people, yes, use the budgeting process, transform it, make it as efficient as possible. To your point, turning from the spaghetti process into a non-spaghetti process. Maybe we'll call that the lasagna process. It's a lot smoother. So that the business can make decisions that are in favor of the business, in the best interest of the business, rather than people focusing on reaching numeric quantitative targets. I think that's a danger I've seen from a governance angle. So, a lot of the qualitative factors need to be brought into the process when people are forecasting, and ensuring that the actual actions of the business, is what we're doing aligned to the core values of the business, to our employees, to our customers, and not just always focus on the quantitative side. I think that's one aspect. The other aspect, and this is a little more boring aspect to a lot of CFOs here, is from an audit perspective, when we audit the budgeting and forecasting process, is quite often people forget about the back end infrastructure. And what I mean by that is quite often businesses, they're very focused on getting out the numbers, redoing the forecast, but they forget about the integrity, ensuring that there are controls to protect the integrity of the numbers. Whether it's about ensuring there's a maker checker process over formulas in Excel, to ensuring that you've got proper security, to ensuring you have proper access controls, so that when HR is feeding into the salaries for the budgets, people actually don't have access to that folder. So I think this is one area that's quite often overlooked. We actually do find from an audit review a number of deficiencies in that area, and I think this is where those who are responsible for the budgeting process, you also need to just remind yourself to ensure that your back end controls over the process and systems and the security is there. And in particular, for people now going to the cloud, using the cloud for your budgeting process is ensuring that you have comfort over that particular area. And one other observation I just wanted to share with you is, it's interesting, quite often you see the annual budgeting process. You go to 30, 40, 50 departments, say, please submit your budget. You start with last year's numbers, etc. And then you have this, debate and little bits of infighting and politics happening to get the numbers you want to get, in particular on the expenditure line. Nobody's going to criticize you for having a high revenue line if you think you can really do that, depending on the type of business you have. What's interesting, I've seen some organizations whereby the CFO office will actually change the budgeting process slightly by saying, I'm going to give you your budget, and it's a rebuttable presumption that it is correct. So this is based on the CFO in consultation with leadership. They'll give the budgets for the various departments, and it's up to departments to then fight back. I shouldn't say fight back. I like to use Tim's words, collaborate in a different way to have a robust discussion. So it's a tactic to get a robust discussion and some vigor into the budgeting process. And that seems to have a different, I don't know if it's psychological or what, but I find that you do come up with a slightly more refined budgeting process that's it's more plausible, it's more defendable. I think people are more genuine in what the budget should comprise of, rather than thinking about their own natural selfish needs, in terms of trying to overstate expenses and understate revenue, so that in the future, if it's monitored, any positive variances would be very, very good for them. So just wanted to share that bit with you.
I think that's a very good point, Chris. Actually, when you mentioned the CFO office would give a first draft of the budget and say, "Here, that's it," and now tell me if you think otherwise. I think that's a valid approach, but there's some prerequisites to that. So that means the language that you speak has to be the same across the business, and when it means language is the data that you use, the drivers of your budget, the KPIs that flow into that. If you are at that point, I think that is already quite advanced from a business intelligence point of view, that you were able to make very clear definitions of every single driver of your budget, and everyone in the business understands it the same way. Then you actually, at that point, I think you can do that. What I've realized in most companies, if you ask someone about a specific driver, that be it an online business where you say customer retention, for example. So how do you calculate the customer retention? Everyone will have a view of what customer retention means. When is a customer retained? Is it because the customer has been signed up and active at least once in the last 12 years? Has the 12 months? Has the user been signed up for 6 months and used the service at least twice a month? Is that one active or retained or not? So I think you have to come down to a very clear definition where finance has the same understanding, operations has the same understanding, sales and marketing has the same understanding. And then if you build your budget on these commonly accepted definitions of data, I think then you could go down that route and come up with a budget, because you can argue it, and the person that receives your top-down budget actually can drill down and see where the numbers come from and can prepare the answer. And it doesn't have to be negative. It can be, if you say fight back. Yes, previously, yes, in my previous company, we talked about a budget fight, but it was more in a positive sense. There was one period of the year where actually the finance department went out and spoke to everyone in the company. So I think you should see that more of an opportunity as well. Obviously, not everybody is looking forward to budget season, but take that as an opportunity to actually engage with the business, speak to them, learn from them, and give them your views from the finance department.
I think, Michael, those are all absolutely spot on points. And I just also want to add here, taking what you've just said about improving the budgeting process in terms of a very active, positive collaboration discussion, is after all is said and done. And again, I'm just going to come from an auditor's perspective here, is when we restart the budgeting process the following year, one positive activity we've seen is for those departments that have done a postmortem, and this is very interesting. Not many people do postmortems to say, okay, here was our budget, here are the variances, etc. Now, rather than talk about the variances, what could we have done better in the budgeting process? What were the assumptions we made a year ago that perhaps were not as valid? Or what were the circumstances that caused us to be too far or too close to the budget? And I think that sort of post-mortem activity, it's going back to the whole business intelligence that both David and Tim were talking about, is it's constantly improving the process. So yes, you can absolutely get out of the spaghetti situation, but once you get there, at the end of the day, you have people making assumptions or presumptions and trying to validate their point of view to what Mike was just saying, having those debates. I would recommend people to go back to that 8, 9, 12 months after the fact, and ask yourselves, okay, what went right, what went wrong, and what can we do to improve it going forward for the next budgeting and forecasting cycle.
Which is good, because that means that people are already using the budget and the forecasts in a sensible way. They're not just using it to see, have I reached my budget? I'm good. Have I not reached my budget? Say the budgeting process doesn't really work, and it's not really so valid. So you're already at a point where people actually use those numbers and they know how to work with data. That could also be a contribution by a CFO if they don't look only at finance, but take over the entire business intelligence operations of a business, not just to provide quantitative data, but also educate the business how to use it. And on top of that, develop or foster a data-driven culture where people actually really use the data. And that means they would also be interested in that type of retrospective analysis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, perhaps just one other little theme connected to that. I mean, the budget process in some companies can be so painful and takes so long that, a few companies have just decided it's not worth the effort. I mean, I remember probably 10 or 20 years ago, Toyota gave up with the idea of doing budgets, and they do kind of rolling forecasts, and they just think that's good enough, but every once in a while, I guess those rolling forecasts are used to update incentive plans and things. Why do we really need a budget? There's nothing special about it. It's just another forecast, isn't it?
True. I think you can do that. I feel this budget process, if done in a productive way, is really more about information exchange. As I mentioned earlier, this is where everyone gets together, and you have to get down to numbers. And it also confirms whether everybody has the same understanding of the business. If you talk strategy meetings, if you talk expanding into new markets in the boardroom or some breakout sessions with certain members of the business, you agree very quickly on what can or should be done and what should not be done. But then when it comes down to hard facts, really, for me, very often was then during the creation of the budget, because this is then when you have to agree on hard numbers. So I think there is, while I completely see the argument, and because it is painful, on the other hand, it actually forces you to put your numbers where your mouth is. For everyone, not just for finance, for the entire business.
Yeah, so that goes a little bit back to what people say. It's not the plan which is important, but the planning process, because it is instilling that conversation between the people to actually agree on something and creating transparency. And it's more that aspect which is important. The numbers are also important, but I guess what I hear as well, it's that conversation and transparency which is important, and also to triggering the change and triggering the understanding on where are we heading with that new direction, which is the budget based on.
Yeah, correct. And I think that is something that you should communicate right away, very openly. That is one of the points of preparing your budget.
And then it's actually and that actually might then mean that we say, okay, with this in mind, I understand that the budget process might feel dreary, but it's also a learning process, and that's why I'm committing to that budget process, because it's actually a learning process for all of us. And I think that might be something to maybe not change the budget process, but at least gives a different spin.
Yes, yeah.
I also would like that, just from a purely governance point of view, just pick up on David's question or challenge in terms of some organizations just giving up budgets. I think at the end of the day, each organization has to find the tools that they feel is appropriate for their operation. And if they want to do something out of the box, by all means, they should try it. Ultimately, regardless of what they do, they need to be accountable and they need to take ownership. And I think for a lot of traditional companies or non-traditional companies, the budgeting process is very much a starting point in order for proper oversight from board members, etc., and other stakeholders. So I have a feeling that budgets will always be there, but I would agree with David's point. That is, after you have that budgeting process and you've completed it, hopefully you've done it in a very painless as possible. You can undertake many other tactics and tools to manage the business, not manage the numbers, but manage the business. And I look forward to seeing how organizations do that in innovative and creative ways versus the traditional just let's have a budget and then we'll just update the forecast every 1 or 2 months.